31st of December 2011 in Il Giornale. La colonna alludes to Angela Merkel as in Berlusconi's alleged victim, colonna inchiavabile, apparently overheard in a wiretapped conversation. In an era of unprecedented vulgarity in Italian political discourse, the episode prompted Vito Tartamella, author of Parolacce and blog of the same name, to comment: difficile immaginare che l'atto resti senza conseguenze diplomatiche, tanto più che il sessismo in Germania è inammissibile. This study sets out to assess the implications of Tartamella's affirmation, i.e. that sexism is taboo in Northern European contexts, while in Italy, in the age of Berlusconi, it's not only admissible, but in fact the norm. In today's global flow of information, translated news circulates in a matter of minutes. This speed relies on forms of meaning transfer that seem to privilege ideological evaluations of the Italian reality in terms of language and gender from the perspectives of other cultures. Thus, it becomes crucial to understand the mechanisms afoot in translation in the media, especially when conveying information on culturally contingent and potentially sensitive issues. The study presented today focuses on responses in the British press to some particular examples of Berlusconi's use of language, the supposed insult to German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and reactions to Berlusconi's suggestion for a new party name. In the broader context of this research, verbal incidents involving Rosy Bindi and Margaret Thatcher are also examined, but due to time constraints are not discussed here. But first, I'd like to outline the analytical and methodological frameworks adopted in the study. Then I'll summarise the theoretical perspectives underpinning the research and contextualise the concept of post-feminism in relation to this work. Finally, I'll discuss the case studies and conclude with some tentative comments on the initial results of the inquiry. The framework of analysis is multidisciplinary, drawing largely on critical discourse analysis and its application to translation studies and media studies. Schaffner was the first to adopt CDA in the analysis of translation in news reporting. She notes how it can be used to expose the practice of, and I quote, using and abusing texts for the purpose of national ideologies and positive self-representation and negative presentation of others. The data for this study was gathered according to subject relevance from a cross-section of British newspapers. Texts were sourced from newspaper websites and the newspaper database Nexus UK. This pool was then further refined by selecting individual texts in order to maintain a variety of sources reflecting the different newspaper genres and their various ideological perspectives. One thing I'd just like to mention here, I did use websites, so they're online newspapers, which brings into the discourse also about image. So we then have multi-semiotic texts which require further analysis, different types of analysis. The theoretical premise for this paper will now be briefly outlined, positing that language usage and linguistic structures constantly evolve within a triad of society, language, and culture. From the social-linguistic view taken in this study, language and social life are inextricably tied. Thus, while gender inequality continues to exist, so language and social life continues to undermine women. Lepsky states, and I quote, "Sex discrimination and gender stereotyping colour the whole of language and are reinforced by it." Bourdieu suggests that a symbolic dimension of male domination exists in postmodern societies. I quote, "A gentle violence, imperceptible and invisible, even to its victims, exerted for the most part through purely symbolic channels of communication and cognition." No better example could be found of this symbolic violence than in what McRobbie calls the unapologetic hate speech of Silvio Berlusconi. Yet language needs a context in order to be interpreted. As Catan points out, language takes on meaning within a culture and tends to condition our thoughts. Thus, Berlusconi's use of the Italian language could be construed as the result of his habitus. As Signorelli posits, and I quote, "I comportamenti di Silvio Berlusconi in materia di donne e di sesso non sono estemporanei e incongruenti, sono stati e sono costanti e coerenti, il che dimostra che non nascono casualmente da circostanze e occasioni, ma si radicano in una sua solida concezione delle donne e del loro posto nel mondo, e più in generale in una sua solida visione del mondo. In una parola, si radicano nella sua cultura. Questa cultura non è solo sua, ma possiamo ipotizzare che sia largamente condivisa da una platea che mi sembra è ben più vasta del suo elettorato e che comprende sia uomini che donne. From this perspective, the persona of Berlusconi, his actions and his words are a zeitgeist of post-feminist Italy, emblematic of the culture with which he's imbued and that he actively creates. This tenet perhaps should be recalled in the intricate process of communicating between cultures and the conveying of information on sensitive issues where ideologies could collide. As Ross reminds us, and I quote, "It remains potentially problematic to impose one set of discourses on a cultural context in which they're not rooted." This isn't the place to expound on translation theory, but it's worth underlining that the links between language and culture affect meaning transfer in several ways. Relevant to our analysis today is the issue of semantics, that is, how words become endowed with meaning. Examples of this will be illustrated during the analysis, which we will look at shortly. But first, a word on the phenomenon of post-feminism and how it's interpreted for this study. Freedom to choose is the post-feminist mantra. Yet, as Tasca and Negra observe, that possibility to choose is firmly anchored in assumed full economic independence. According to the World Economic Forum Gender Gap Index in 2011, Italy was ranked 90th out of 135 countries for economic participation and opportunity for women, 88th for labour force participation, and 125th in the Wage Equality Survey. Yet, in a recent poll carried out by Census, 76% of Italian women are convinced that post-feminist era has improved the position of women in society. In which ways women's lives have been enhanced by post-feminism, however, remains unclear. McRobbie instead denounces post-feminism and defines it as, and I quote, "a sophisticated anti-feminism that upholds the principles of gender equality while denigrating the figure of the feminist." One of the most virulent manifestations of this anti-feminism, according to McRobbie, can be found in the very language of Berlusconi. And I quote, "At its most extreme, there is the spectacular and unapologetic hate speech of Silvio Berlusconi, who also claims to have supported the career ambitions of young glamorous women, while showering older women who challenge him with torrents of abuse." The older women McRobbie refers to are Berlusconi's other women, the mature, strong and powerful women who do not conform to Berlusconi's solid conception of women and their place in the world. Moving on to the analysis then, we'll now focus on the news narrative surrounding the alleged insult to Merkel and the suggestion to rename the PPL. We will also see how translation is employed to frame those news stories in the British press, thus sustaining underlying ideological aims of the target text producers. So the first thing we're going to analyse is Forza Gnocca, or rather, Forza Gnocca, or rather the translated version Go Pussy, which grabbed the attention of the entire spectrum of the British press. In the same week that saw Celodurismo officially enter the Italian language, Berlusconi reportedly said il nome del PPL non è più nel cuore della gente, faremo fare dei sondaggi. Mi dicono che il nome che avrebbe maggiore successo è Forza Gnocca. This is not the first time, and this is where the slide comes in, that Berlusconi has caused comment in the British press by using the term gnocca.
Lower the volume. No,
Is that okay? Okay. So I was saying, it wasn't the first time that he used gnocca. In 2007, from the slide you can see here, Berlusconi debates his debate. And the article accuses Berlusconi of referring to Margaret Thatcher as Bella Gnocca. The British journalist's scorn for Berlusconi's use of language triggered reflection and debate in the Italian press, and in response to the Independent's critique, l'Unità commented thus, highlighting the dilemma of intercultural communication where taboo language is concerned. And what I've highlighted is the difference in blue. La cosa che da noi passa tranquilla, as in Italy, so using a word like gnocca, scandalises the British press. That's the point of the message. So, returning to Forza Gnocca, we will now look at the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, the Guardian, the Daily Star and the Daily Mirror. The rendering "Go Pussy" is common to all the texts and features in the headlines of the Mail, the Guardian and the Star. The word translation, however, doesn't appear in any of the tabloids. Therefore, we do not know who performed the translation or its origin. This is symptomatic of what is called the translator's invisibility. Instead, the Guardian clarifies in the first paragraph that the source language expression was Forza Gnocca, and the journalist adds, which translates as "Go Pussy." This categorical statement implies that this is the only possible interpretation. There's no choice, no nuance, no alternative. A contentious translation choice, to say the least. A glance at two Italian dictionaries indicates the denotative and connotative meanings of the source language term. So, as you can see here, the second definition, ragazza, donna molto sensuale e attraente, donna molto vistosa e attraente. Whereas, and so we can say that as with most taboo words, the context of situation dictates the functional meaning. However, if we compare these definitions with those for pussy, we notice some significant discrepancies. The first dictionary definition, obviously in English, denotes a furry domestic animal, as in pussycat. We have to get to the fourth definition before arriving at one that's similar to gnocca. But as you can see here, a woman or women collectively regarded as a source of sexual intercourse, for example. We can see then that the connotations of gnocca and pussy are not the same and therefore do not have equivalent effect. Comparing another pair of vulgar signifiers further emphasises this linguocultural gap. So, as you can see here, obviously the word figa in Italian is used much more generally than the, let's say, the English equivalent, which remains the worst taboo word, as has been said in the English language. So, the disparity between the superficially corresponding terms is significant. As Partamelle explains, per gli inglesi, figa o cunt è una delle parole più scabrose e significa anche persona spiacevole o stupida. In italiano invece vuol dire l'opposto, che figa, che figo. Hughes goes so far as to say, cunt has been the most serious taboo word in English for centuries and remains so for the vast majority of users. From this we could concede that gnocca, albeit vulgar, is not considered obscene and abusive within its lingua culture, and can also be intended to mean an attractive woman. While the expression, a great piece of pussy, which was the translation regarding Margaret Thatcher, as Hughes notes, is the vocabulary of a misogynistic gangster rapper. The Daily Mirror also tells us that Forza Gnocca equals Go Pussy, thus arousing the suspicion that a North American news agency might have been the source, as the slang term pussy is more common in US discourse than in British. Interestingly, the Mirror censors the offending term with asterisks, as you can see here. The Star, on the other hand, shows no such reticence and uses it in the headline. A photograph of Berlusconi, a very unflattering one, is captioned with a supposed quote between enlarged inverted commas. I think the best name would be Forza Gnocca, Go Pussy. The translation is inaccurate and purports to be direct speech, with the original source text embedded in the statement. Silvio Berlusconi appears underneath the quote, giving the impression that the words were actually his. The Daily Telegraph is unique in its approach by employing what could be considered thick translation. Apaya defines this as an invisible form of translation that provides description, annotation, but most importantly, interpretation and the possibility of more than one perspective. The journalist explains the Italian word Berlusconi used was gnocca, the meaning of which can range from babe or crumpet to the female genitalia. However, links to other articles provide a paratext which perpetuate the news narrative surrounding Berlusconi. To conclude this part, the instrumental use of translation in the Star and the Mail served to create scandal rather than mediate or communicate between cultures. The aim is to sanction the myriad news narratives surrounding Berlusconi with a further example of what the target culture perceives as his linguistic obscenity. However, as we've seen, the lexeme gnocca doesn't carry the same abusive resonance as the English-speaking world's media would have it. The second example brings us to the episode which inspired the headline which I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, Berlusconi's supposed insult to Angela Merkel. The alleged slur, culone incchiarabile, was culled from a wiretapped phone call. Although it was not transcribed, the supposed utterance found its way into the pages of Il Fatto Quotidiano. The rumour made international headlines, provoking meta-debates across linguistic and national boundaries. The German tabloid Bild ran the headline, "Did Berlusconi insult Chancellor Merkel?" Diplomatic reverberations were indeed felt, and Italy suffered the repercussions on European markets as evidenced by fluctuations in the Italian stock market. News narratives in the British press used this episode as the apex of Berlusconi's gaffes and vulgar remarks aimed at women. Intermingled with sordid accounts of prostitutes, bunga-bunga, bribery and corruption, a crescendo of debauchery emerges. Berlusconi's language appears to be increasingly depraved and provides further evidence of his sexism. Thus it becomes increasingly difficult to separate the strands of discourse, the fact from fiction in media frames which further blur distinctions between quality and popular press. However, it's necessary for me to reiterate that the focal point of the research here is a linguistic one, which attempts to analyse linguocultural facets of the perception of sexist language in the post-feminist era and how it's relayed across linguocultural boundaries through translation in the news. So, what could be described as Berlusconi's linguistic swan song was well represented across the British press. The texts that I'm going to discuss were drawn from The Independent, The Sun, The Guardian, The Mail and Metro, a free publication distributed on the London Underground. The Independent reported the rumour within a longer article under the sub-headline, Silvio's X-rated diplomacy. First we note the familiar use of Berlusconi's first name. Traditionally a tabloid tactic, it's used with politicians to show contempt. Interpreted thus, the headline can be read, "We know Silvio and we know him framed within a certain context." Therefore, we're not at all surprised by the adjectival phrase X-rated. A clear association is thus made between the obscene nature of the insult and an intertextual reference to scandals surrounding Berlusconi. The paradoxical combination of X-rated with diplomacy lends an ironic tone, which is confirmed by the ideological slant of the piece. Merkel is described as victim to Berlusconi's sexist language, in spite of being, and I quote, the world's most powerful woman. Berlusconi is referred to as the Playboy Premier, the gaffe-prone tycoon. Both are common descriptors in tabloid journalism, but in a quality paper belie the gravity of the subject. Even more serious is the accusation that the gaffe-prone tycoon has been overheard referring to German leader as an unfuckable lardass. The claim is then mitigated with the addition, according to wiretaps reported in the Italian newspapers. Go on. Okay, I'll show you another example. So here, what you can see here, the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail, instead of using the full expression unfuckable lardass, you can't see here because there's a photograph over it, I'm terribly sorry, is the asterisks, uses asterisks to censor the obscenity. No mention is made of translation or of the source language. Another example, here we have Metro, and again, they use asterisks to cover the unfuckable and also arse. And here we have the Sun, which flatly refuses to use anything and saying, as it's a family newspaper, cannot possibly make any reference to the expression except to say it's too vulgar to mention. So here we have a summary of how the expression was actually rendered in the various British newspapers. So, referring then to taboo language, the translational choice of unfuckable provided some problems for the British press in the British context. Fuck and its variants still retain considerable shock value, and not all newspapers will print it. An alternative to unfuckable could have been unscrewable, which is semantically and etymologically nearer the source of the language term. In fact, The Economist used it in their headline, "The Man Who Screwed a Nation," with its double entendre. So in conclusion, I would say that the articles we've just seen here amuse the British newspapers rather than arouse their censor or serious comment. Berlusconi is castigated with sobriquets such as Smutty Silvio, Sleazy Silvio, which add a comic tenor rather than a serious note. It gave the Anglophone press yet another opportunity to gloat on the supposed verbal indiscretion, giving them once again invaluable material to ridicule women, Berlusconi and Italy. So my closing comments are, through the melange of translation and skewed representation, the picture that emerges from this preliminary review is one in which Berlusconi's sexist language in the British press serves, the translation of which serves only to perpetuate convenient news narratives. Berlusconi's verbal denigration of women is used to contextualise other media discourse, focusing on his scandals, thus potentially rendering the sexist comments comic rather than seriously offensive. Simultaneously, the female politicians appear to be ridiculed rather than championed by the British newspapers. Frau Merkel, the matronly and respectable Bindi, and Thatcher, the great piece of pussy, have all been insulted by the crooner, the playboy, and the permatan 75-year-old Gazprom media tycoon. Hyperbole and cluster of adjectives dominate the text, while the approaches to translation itself are scopus-orientated. That is, they don't serve the purpose of greater understanding or social criticism on sexist language, but to tailor the news to fit the target cultural consumer. With regards post-feminism, surely new sexism is a more appropriate definition of the symbolic verbal violence used against women, not only evident in Berlusconi's language, but also perceptible in the media discourses of the receiving culture. Hipkins has suggested, and I quote, that Anglo-American post-feminist thought might give Italian thinkers the incentive to look outside Italy for some solutions to their problems and see what they have in common with other contexts. What appears to come to light here is the hidden discrimination latent in the British texts, not only towards Italy and Italians through marked stereotyping, but also through a very subtle form of sexism towards all women in general. We could conclude then that new sexism is just old sexism that never went away. Thus, in response to Hipkins' appeal to Italian thinkers, by all means, take a look outside Italy, but instead of solutions, you might just find sexism dressed up in a different cultural guise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Denise for a fascinating paper that's opened up a lot of very rich and productive issues. We'll move straight on to the next paper, Giovanna Alfani, who's going to be speaking to us today about the language of Italian press and female identity in the last period of Berlusconi's government. Giovanna graduated from Genoa University and attained a PhD from Cardiff University with a dissertation on medieval literature. And she's currently teaching at the Adam, I'm not going to be able to speak about Mickiewicz University in Poland. And this research comes out of her current project, I think. So any questions that you might have had for Denise will